Information-fueled.
Opinion-driven.
This is Nashville's Morning News with Dan Mandis.
And so, my fellow Americans,
we talk news.
8:07, Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. And welcome on in to the final hour of Nashville's Morning News here for this Wednesday, April 16th. Hope you are doing well. Alarming story that came out yesterday, although I don't believe that people that follow this kind of thing were surprised, but alarming story nonetheless, in a dramatic rise in autism. Listen to this. This is from CNN. About 1 in every 31 children was diagnosed with autism by age 8 in 2022. That is up from 1 in 36 in 2020, according to the CDC report published on Tuesday. They say rates have varied widely by gender, race, and geographic area. So very interesting. And a lot of people are combing through all of these studies. Dustin Kittle joins us. You remember Dustin from a previous interview we did out in Santa Fe, Tennessee. Environmental and agricultural attorney Dustin Kittle joins us. Dustin, how are you? And you live in this world of, autism, the accusation, of course, RFK Jr., and many people have said that pesticides and vaccines and these kinds of things could be part of the problem here. So let's first of all talk about this dramatic rise in autism. How shocked were you that these numbers, the numbers that came out yesterday?
Well, good morning, Dan, and appreciate you having me on. Certainly was not shocked in looking at those numbers. This is continuing a trend that we've seen really over the last 40 years to where autism rates have increased significantly. There were a couple of things that made this study a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. This was a cross-sectional study that evaluated sites all across the country. And we saw a great variation between different geographic locations, which would seem to indicate that there are environmental factors that are playing a role in autism. The one other disturbing trend is you talked about 1 in 31 kids by age 8 who are now being diagnosed with autism. If you look at boys in particular, that number is all the way down to 1 in 20. And so just as a comparison, when we were looking at these numbers 25 years ago, back in 2020, we were talking about 1 in 150 kids. And certainly there's something to be said for the fact that we are able to evaluate this condition a little bit better, with each passing year. But there is certainly something going on. All the experts seem to agree on this. Something is going on beyond the fact that we're just able to identify this better.
Dustin, let me ask you, you said, I think you said environmental factors?
Yes.
Well, okay, so for someone who isn't ingrained in this conversation, can you define that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's really, I break this down into two components. One would be genetic. There is no question that when we look at the data on autism, genetics plays a role. In fact, the biggest risk factor as far as a child having autism is whether they have a sibling that may have autism. And so those are the situations to where something in their genetics is either making them more susceptible to this condition, or it may be a situation to where they are just predestined to have that condition. Environmental would be the types of things that we can prevent. And when you look at environmental, you're really looking at 3 stages. That would be the prenatal stage while the child is in the womb, the birth stage, and then post-birth. The data that we've been compiling says that a child could be diagnosed with autism at any point before they turn 3 years old. And what we are seeing is there are healthy children that are being born, but by the time they turn 1 to 2 years old, they have changes and ultimately become diagnosed with autism.
Okay, a very powerful statement. And I know that I've been talking about this for a long time, but you are somebody who is a part of this community of people that have been watching this rise of autism rates over the years. As a matter of fact, in our previous conversations, you told me a little bit about your relationship with RFK Jr. and how, as he was planning on joining the Trump administration, you were part of that team. Let's talk a little bit about what could be causing this. I mean, I know you said, and a lot of people will say, well, it's just, some people are saying it is just based on the fact that we can now identify autism more concisely than ever before. But it sounds to me like you think that there's perhaps other things at play.
I think even the experts that maybe 10 years ago thought that that was the case, to where we were just getting better as far as being able to diagnose this condition, would agree now that the trends show there is something going on from an environmental standpoint. And RFK is a former environmental attorney. And one of the things that I think is going to strengthen the HHS under his leadership is the fact that he's getting rid of the corporate capture, the revolving door, to where you have people that were working in the CDC and the NIH who didn't want us to look at things like vaccines and whether they might possibly have some kind of trigger that is leading to autism. Some of the most recent studies are showing that this could all come back to gut health, as far as the relationship between the gut and the brain. There is something, though, that is going on. And RFK made a key statement when he made an announcement recently saying that he expected to have the causes, at least a portion of the causes, released by September, and charged the NIH with that duty. He says that he believes autism will ultimately be found to be preventable. And that's a huge statement.
That is a massive statement. Coming up, as I look at this data, they also say a few other things. More prevalent in Asian, Black, and Hispanic kids. That's number one. And more prevalent in what they call socially disadvantaged neighborhoods than what they call wealthy neighborhoods. We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more. Dustin Kittle, an environmental and agricultural attorney, is joining us here on Nashville's Morning News. Real quick, Dustin, hold on. Time to check the roads on WTN. Today, a high of 70, right now 49 at Super Talk 99.7. WTN also going to be sunny. So, Dustin, let me ask you, let me tackle this one at a time. So, the article says, the research says it's more prevalent autism and the rise in autism. You mentioned in boys, and I think that is well known, but also more prevalent in Asian, Black, and Hispanic kids as well, as we look at this alarming rise in autism. Have any idea what's going on there?
I think that comes back and it's showing us that there is some kind of environmental link, because you're seeing the demographic numbers shift. And I wouldn't pretend to say that I have the absolute answer, but I'll give you an example of something we could be looking at. You could have specific areas where, let's just say, their water quality is different. And in these studies that are showing that there is a link between gut health, and really what it's going to come down to is the serotonin level, which is something that affects mood, it affects learning. But you could have an area that might not have quality water, for example. There could be toxins that are getting in a child's system early on that creates a change in that serotonin level. And that's the one thing that we know, is that there is a serotonin variance in these children when we're looking at them. And 90% of the serotonin in your body comes from the gut.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a very dumb question, but I know that there's people that want this question to be asked. What exactly is serotonin? Is that a chemical that your body manufactures?
It is. And again, it's kind of, when we talk about these, there's some pharmaceuticals, obviously, that regulate serotonin. And people that have low serotonin, for example, are depressed. They would exhibit signs of being depressed. It's really, I compare serotonin to being kind of like a volume knob. And let's say that you're listening to music and between 6 and 8 on the scale is where you need to be. You need to fall in that. what we are seeing in kids with autism, sometimes that volume knob is turned a little bit far down. They might be at a 3 or 4. Or sometimes you might have a situation where the serotonin is too loud. And it really all comes down to their ability to process information. And it's why you have the different categories as far as an autism spectrum, to where you can have a highly functioning individual that may be able to process information at such a high level. The information is going at such a high level, it's impossible for them to break it down and to be able to communicate what they're actually thinking. And so that's where the serotonin is coming from. Again, 90% of it produced at the gut level, and an interesting connection there. There have been studies that have shown that certain vaccine components, including mercury, can have an impact as far as creating a variance in the body's level of serotonin.
So we've always had the suspicion that vaccines have been connected to the rising level of autism. Knowing what you know about RFK Jr., people would say that he's a vaccine skeptic, if you will. Do you believe, or have you heard any scuttlebutt that this is going to be connected to the vaccines?
This is what I would say about RFK. RFK is a trial attorney. And you know, a lot of times that reputation, creates some negatives. But what he's trying to do is ultimately create a case and look at the evidence and take it where it leads him. And when it comes to vaccines, when there are so many people, and I compare this to the glyphosate issue that we just dealt with here in Tennessee. Yep. When it comes to vaccine, when you've got so many people, particularly from the pharmaceutical industry, saying this is a closed issue, there are no links whatsoever. It's kind of like a kid that's playing hide and go seek. You go in and turn a light on, they say, well, nobody's in here. Well, that lets you know when they start saying, don't even look in this direction, there could be a link that's there. And that's what I'll say about Kennedy. I think he will look at all the evidence, present it to the public. I don't think from his statements he has the political capital to do anything that's going to change vaccines, nor do I necessarily think that he should. But we need the public to have information. We need to educate them on what is going on and let them make their own decisions.
You mentioned, and again, I realize I'm asking very pedantic questions, but I'm not a scientist or an attorney or anything. But you mentioned gut level and the serotonin level.
Right.
So is that something that is based on what someone is eating, has eaten when they were kids? What does that mean?
So it could be those things, but more likely, I'll tell you, one of the autism studies went back and looked at prenatal issues involving the mothers. And there was a significantly higher rate of children born with autism where the mother might have taken an antibiotic during the period of time that she was pregnant. And what that antibiotic could do to the fetus is make a change in what's called the microbiome. And again, just to simplify it, we're talking about things that ultimately from the stomach can affect the brain. And, same thing with vaccines when you're looking at that. It's not necessarily what you're eating, but it is how that gut is developed, because ultimately there is a connection between the gut and the brain.
That is fascinating. Interesting.
I'll say this was thought to be a debunked, and we hear this all the time.
Oh, we sure do.
But the gut health issue, as far as the connection with the brain and the link there, was thought to be a debunked issue. But as we see time and time again, some of these things that are debunked were debunked for a reason. That's because they didn't want the truth to be found out. But it really aligns with everything RFK has talked about as far as this Make America Healthy Again movement. And you haven't heard a whole lot about this connection with gut health and the brain. But I think as we get closer to September and we start releasing these root causes, that's what we will find. Because vaccines in and of themselves, I agree, vaccines is not causing autism, but is it triggering something inside the body that is the actual root cause? And for example, disturbance of the microbiome in the gut that's actually creating signals that go to your brain in how you behave and how you learn.
Okay. So when this report comes out in September, you mentioned this earlier, but I want to get it in a more direct answer. Do you think that the report in September, do you think that it'll lead to any kind of policy changes? Will it lead to any kind of maybe a relook at some of these vaccines or, maybe pesticides, whatever it may be? Will the report lead, in your opinion, to any kind of change?
I think it will, because I think what we will see is with some of this, the evidence might be so overwhelming that we need to take another look. And I'm talking about things in particular with the pharmaceutical industry. Are there things that are going on with the pharmaceutical industry that is creating a higher rate of autism? And, people say, back to the point of, are we just discovering this better? I think from a genetic standpoint, there probably has always been something there as far as kids that have autism in a situation to where the environment's not affecting it. But where the policy comes in or what environmental changes can we make to ensure that these kids are not developing autism as a result of something we are doing.
Fascinating. All right, Dustin, I appreciate you being on with us. Is there anything about this conversation that we've missed that I should have asked?
No, I mean, I just think this. I think the community in science, community in health, Nashville has great facilities in that regard. We just need to keep an open mind. At the end of the day, we shouldn't be ruling out anything from vaccines to antibiotics to anything else. Let's take a holistic look. Let's take a look at everything. Let's see where the evidence leads us. All
right, Dustin, how can people find you on X?
I am on X at Dustin Kittle and would love to have you following along.
Kittle. Dustin, as always, thank you very much. And I know that I'll be asking for your help again as we navigate through this really interesting Dustin Kittle. All right. Joan Jones has the news coming up at 8:30. Hey, Joan.
Yeah, that was pretty fascinating. Okay, it's being called a miraculous rescue of the East Tennessee pastor who was kidnapped in South Africa. We've got some details. And the motivation behind the firebombing of the Pennsylvania governor's mansion, now it's revealed. We're also going to take a look at the stock market after the opening bell. Those stories coming up here at 8:30 on Super Talk 99.7 WTN.